is nature always called Mother Nature? Perhaps it's because, like any mother, she quietly manages so much of our living without our ever realizing there's a woman at work. Why, right from the beginning, we breathe and sleep and wake up with no more conscious planning than we used in sprouting teeth. Mother Nature controls many of our routine bodily processes through automatic control centers called glands. The story of menstruation really begins with one particular gland. It's located here at the base of the brain, and it's called the pituitary gland. In our childhood years, this pituitary gland concentrates on producing growth hormones, busy little messengers which circulate through the bloodstream. They order the various bones and tissues to get growing. And as a girl grows up from blocks to dolls to books, that means her body is obeying the orders issued by the pituitary gland. Of course, these orders vary among different girls. Some girls grow short, some tall, some heavy, and some slight. But there comes a time somewhere between the ages of 11 and 17, though about 13 is average, when the pituitary must turn part of its attention to maturing the body which it has grown. So it starts sending out a new type of hormone, a maturing hormone. And that is when menstruation begins, when these maturing hormones start coming down through the bloodstream to the ovaries. The ovaries themselves are glands about the size of almonds, and locked within each ovary are thousands of eggs. Although these eggs are too small to be seen by the human eye, any one of them has the possibility of someday becoming a human being. Near the ovaries are the fallopian tubes, short canals which lead to the uterus or womb. This hollow pear-shaped organ opens into the vagina, which is part of the birth canal and is the external opening for this whole group of organs. So, as you see, there is a continuous passage from each ovary through the fallopian tubes, uterus, and vagina to the outside of the body. These organs function in a continuous cycle. The pituitary gland starts the process when it sends its maturing hormones down through the bloodstream to the ovaries. Now one of the ovaries passes on an order of its own to the uterus. It tells the cells which make up the lining of the uterus to multiply and fill themselves with watery fluids and blood. This begins to build up a thickened lining of somewhat velvety material. At the same time, an ovary has been maturing an ovum or egg, which is magnified here so that we can see it. About once a month, one of these tiny eggs passes out of the ovary and finds its way into a fallopian tube, where it moves along toward the uterus. If the egg is impregnated, which happens when a woman is going to have a child, the egg will stay within the uterus. Then the thickened lining will provide nourishment for the budding human being through the early days of its development. However, most eggs pass through the fallopian tubes without being fertilized. When this happens, there's no use for that potential nourishment in the built-up lining of the uterus. And so, in a few days, it passes from the body. This is the flow which we call menstruation. So, as we see now, menstruation is just one routine step in a normal and natural cycle that is going on continuously within the body. The time between periods is usually about 28 days. However, it may be shorter for some girls, longer for others. The flow itself may last anywhere from 3 days to 7. Yet each of these different schedules may be normal. For just as the pituitary gland orders some girls to grow short, some tall, some heavy, and some slight, so its orders about menstruation may differ widely among normal women. The important thing is that you should be fairly regular within yourself. Of course, a girl may be irregular during the first year or so, but after that, when her system is settled down into a routine, her period should always be about the same number of days apart and last about the same length of time. Try not to throw yourself off schedule by getting overtired, emotionally upset, or catching cold. And if your timing goes seriously wrong, or you're bothered with severe cramps or headaches, you should have a talk with your doctor. Of course, you'll want to keep a personal calendar. Mark the first day of each period and check to see that there are about the same number of days between periods. It's not only a useful record of past performance, but it comes in handy when you have to plan ahead. This calendar appears in an interesting booklet called Very Personally Yours. This booklet has been prepared to enlarge upon what you learn from this brief film. Among other things, the booklet explodes that old taboo against bathing during your period. Not only can you bathe, you should bathe. Because during menstruation, your perspiration glands are working overtime. Just be careful to avoid either very hot water or very cold water. In fact, it's not a good idea at any time to shock your system with extremes, any more than to let yourself get chilled or to catch cold. And as for the old taboo against exercise, that's nonsense. Exercise is good for you during menstruation. Just use common sense. When you come to think of it, most of your daily routine is on the mild side. It's going to extremes that's wrong and to be avoided. To most girls, the menstrual period should bring no severe discomfort. Some girls have a little less pep, a feeling of pressure in the lower part of the body, perhaps an occasional twinge or a touch of nerves. But don't let it get you down. After all, no matter how you feel, you have to live with people. You have to live with yourself, too. And once you stop feeling sorry for yourself and take those days in your stride, you'll find it's easier to keep smiling and even-tempered. You can do practically everything you normally do. Oh, come now. We said practically everything, provided you take common sense care of yourself. Exercises to relieve cramps are illustrated in the booklet. Try them. With the guidance of a qualified person, you may find they help. And do something about that slouch. Slumpy posture is just as bad inside as it looks outside. So stand up straight and let the organs function from the position that nature intended. One way to help them function normally is to avoid constipation. You see, your reproductive organs lie between the rectum and the bladder and their external openings, and constipation will disturb the relationship between these organs. So you'll find it worth your while to drink plenty of water, eat plenty of fruit, and to include cereals and eggs and leafy vegetables in your daily diet. And incidentally, it's smart to keep looking smart. That well-groomed feeling will give you new poise and lift your morale, especially when it's backed up with year-round fresh air and sunshine and plenty of rest and sleep. Because the best possible insurance against trouble on those days is healthy living every day. And that's the story. There's nothing strange nor mysterious about menstruation. All life is built on cycles, and the menstrual cycle is one normal and natural part of nature's eternal plan for passing on the gift of life.
Hi everyone, we're here to talk about the mikveh today. It's the purification process that the Jews use to purify themselves and cleanse themselves of all impurities. And this has been very widely associated with women and their menstrual cycle. As you just viewed the very, very concise video that was put out many, many years ago and showed the very natural process that God created in women to prepare them to conceive. Now, if you look at all the creation, okay, this menstruation is by no means poisonous or impure. This is the Jewish interpretation of the natural process of our existence. If you look at any other species, animals, now this is not to say we are like them, we are civilized human beings, but animals clean up their own placenta and they clean their babies off with their mouth. So they ingest the bloodshed and they ingest the placenta and they clean their babies off and they don't die. And they're not cursed. Okay? This is something, this is a ritualistic practice. This is a tradition of man, and this is the way the Jews have interpreted to make a person pure. Okay? Similarly to when I showed you about the circumcision. God put that foreskin on the man's penis. It was a heightened flesh of sensitivity to erotic pleasure with a woman. And because they want to adhere to the law, the Levitical laws that were interpreted by man, who they claim was divinely inspired, and I have to disagree with that, because God is first on my list, okay, and not man. And I know that God created us in his image, okay. This is not the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay, where these male and female were created in the image of the gods out of clay. Okay, if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are several stories that describe the beginnings of creation. Okay, and if you trace back some of these ritualistic mikvahs and circumcisions and all, it's to combat the fact that we were created by, not by God, by these other gods. Okay, I encourage you to go and search out and read and research. Do your own research and find out. The Lord says, seek and you shall find. And when you seek and you shall find, you uncover the lies, people. You throw off the oppression. And definitely women have been oppressed by this mikveh. And I'm going to just introduce you to some of the aspects of it, and you make your own decisions. Okay? Mikveh is a bath that's used for the purpose of ritual immersions in Judaism to achieve ritual purity. After the destruction of the temple, the mikveh's main uses remained as follows. By Jewish women to achieve ritual purity after menstruation and childbirth, before they and their husbands may resume marital relations. So she needs to clean that stuff out, okay, before they can engage again in intercourse. By Jewish men to achieve ritual purity after ejaculation, as part of the traditional procedure for conversion to Judaism. to immerse newly acquired metal and glass utensils used in serving and eating food, and to immerse a corpse as part of the preparation for burial, which is also called tahara. Most forms of ritual impurity can be purified through immersion in any natural collection of water. However, some impurities, such as a zav, require living water, such as springs or underground water wells. Living water has the further advantage of being able to purify even while flowing, as opposed to rainwater, which must be stationary in order to purify. The mikveh is designed to simplify this requirement by providing a bathing facility that remains in contact with a natural source of water. Now I'll just show you a couple of pictures that show you an ancient mikveh bath and a contemporary one. This is a medieval mikveh, and the next image is a contemporary mikveh. In Orthodox Judaism, these regulations are steadfastly adhered to, and consequently the mikveh is central to an Orthodox Jewish community. They formally hold in conservative Judaism as well. The existence of a mikveh is considered so important that a Jewish community is required to construct a mikveh even before building a synagogue, and must go to the extreme of selling Torah scrolls or even a synagogue if necessary to provide funding for its construction. The requirement of a mikveh. The traditional rules regarding the construction of a mikveh are based on those specified in classical rabbinical literature. According to these rules, a mikveh must be connected to a natural spring or well of naturally occurring water, and thus can be supplied by rivers and lakes which have natural springs as their source. A cistern filled by the rainwater is also permitted to act as a mikveh's water supply, so long as the water is never collected in a vessel. Similarly, snow, ice, and hail are allowed to act as a supply of water to a mikveh, no matter how they were transferred to the mikveh. A river that dries up upon occasion cannot be used because it is presumed to be rainwater and not spring water, which cannot purify while in a flowing state. Oceans and seas, for the most part, have the status of natural springs. The mikveh must, according to the classical regulations, contain enough water to cover the entire body of an average-sized person. Based on a mikveh with the dimensions of 3 cubits deep, 1 cubit wide, and 1 cubit long, the necessary volume of water was estimated at being 40 seh of water. Now, I'm not going to go into those terms, okay? I'm going to go into the historic reasons for the mikveh. It says, traditionally, the mikveh was used by both men and women to regain ritual purity after various events, according to regulations laid down by the Torah and in classical rabbinical literature. The Torah requires full immersion. After keri, which is normal emissions of semen, whether from sexual activity or from nocturnal emissions, bathing in a mikveh due to keri is required by the Torah in order that one should be allowed to consume from a heave offering or a sacrifice, while Ezra instituted that one should also do so in order to be allowed to recite words of Torah. After Zava, abnormal discharges of body fluids. Certain skin conditions, these are termed lepra in the Septuagint, and therefore traditionally translated into English as leprosy. This is probably a translation error, as the Greek term lepra mostly refers to psoriasis, and the Greek term leprosy was elephas or elephantitis. By anyone who came into contact with someone suffering from Zava, or into contact with someone still in Nida, which is normal menstruation, or who comes into contact with articles that have been used or sat upon by such persons. So, this is very interesting with this coronavirus and these masks that we have covering our faces. In Home Depot and in Lowe's, they had, lawn furniture, and they would not allow people to sit on the furniture. And I couldn't figure out why. And you see, this is behind, the Jews are behind the masks, and they're behind not sitting on furniture for people to transmit impurities to one another. It's saying it right here. It says, by a Kohen who is being consecrated, by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, after sending away the goat to Azazel, and by the man who leads away the goat. By the Kohen who performed the red heifer ritual, after contact with a corpse or a grave, in addition to having the ashes of a red heifer ritual sprinkled upon them, and after eating meat from an animal that died naturally. Classical rabbinical writers conflated the rules for Zava and Nida. That means they mixed them. Conflated is they overlapped them so that they blurred the boundaries. That's what conflated means. I lost my place. It became customary for Kohanim to fully immerse themselves before Jewish holidays, and the laity of many communities subsequently adopted this practice. Converts to Judaism are required to undergo full immersion in water. Orthodox Judaism generally adheres to classical regulations and traditions, and consequently Orthodox Jewish women are obligated to immerse in mikveh between nida and sexual relations with their husbands. This includes brides before their marriage and married women after their menstruation period or childbirth, in accordance with Orthodox rules concerning modesty. Men and women are required to immerse in separate mikveh facilities in separate locations, or to use the mikveh at the different designated times. It is customary for Orthodox Jews to immerse before Yom Kippur, and married women sometimes do it as well. In the customs of certain Jewish communities, men also use mikveh before Jewish holidays. The men in certain communities, especially Hasidic and Haredi groups, also practice immersion before each Shabbat. And some immerse in a mikveh every single day. Although the Temple Mount is treated by many Orthodox Jewish authorities as being forbidden territory, a number of groups permit access but require immersion before ascending to the Mount as a precaution. All right. Orthodox Judaism requires that vessels and utensils must be immersed in a mikveh before being used for food if they are purchased or received from a non-Jew. that would be somebody like me. That they would have to sterilize it because I'm not a Jew. I am impure in their eyes. I am goyim. Obligatory immersion in Orthodox Judaism. Women following the Niddah period after menstruation prior to resuming marital relations. Following the Niddah period after childbirth prior to resuming marital relations by a bride before her wedding. Now, either gender as part of conversion to Judaism and immersion of utensils acquired from a Gentile and used for food. Men, by a bridegroom on the day of his wedding, according to the custom of some communities. By a father prior to circumcision of his son, according to the custom of some communities. By a Kohen prior to a service in which he will recite the priestly blessing, according to the custom of some communities. Before Yom Kippur, according to the custom of some communities. Before Rosh Hashanah, according to the custom of some communities. Before Jewish holidays, weekly before Shabbat, under Hasidic and Haredi customs, and every day under Hasidic customs. Rabbi Arai Kaplan connects the laws of impurity to the narrative in the beginning of Genesis. According to Genesis, by eating of the fruit, Adam and Eve had brought death into the world. Kaplan points out that most of the laws of impurity relate to some form of death, or in the case of Niddah, the loss of a potential life. One who comes into contact with one of the forms of death must be immersed in water, which is described in Genesis as flowing out of the Garden of Eden, the source of life, in order to cleanse oneself of this contact with death and by extension of sin. So basically, they're relating the sin in the Garden of Eden, okay, with the fact of death. Now, Father said, you committed this sin, you didn't listen to me, and now you're going to die. And the devil convinced Eve that she wasn't going to die, and she took of the forbidden fruit, which we all know is a metaphor for sex. But the Jews are carrying this into ritualism, where they believe that the menstruation that a woman sheds is a dead carcass, and it cannot be touched. I'm going to tell you this from my own reading. All right, so when they have intercourse, and if the seed doesn't take root in the lining of the uterus in the menstruation to start the creation of life, that menstruation, when it leaves the body, is considered a dead carcass and cannot be touched. So therefore, they may have to separate during her period and for 7 to 8 days later, which means they sleep in separate beds and they're not allowed to come together after that. And then at the end of that 2-week period, she has to go into a mikveh and clean herself out. Now, consequently, this is a time of ovulation again. Okay, 2 weeks after the beginning of a period, which lasts somewhere between 6 to 7 days, 5 to 7 days, and then the laws of purification is another 7 days. You're talking about 2 weeks separated in the bedroom, and when you do finally come together, you're ovulating. And this is why they use this to just keep reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, and the women become baby machines. Okay? And I'm I'm just going to keep reading this. Okay, I'm just going to keep reading this. I hope you wake up, people. According to Genesis, by eating of the fruit, Adam and Eve had brought death into the world. Kaplan points out that most of the laws of impurity relate to some form of death, or in some cases, nada, the loss of potential life. One who comes into contact with one of the forms of death must then immerse in water, which is described in Genesis as flowing out of the Garden of Eden, the source of life, in order to cleanse oneself of this contact with death and, by extension, of sin. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook offered an additional message for mikveh. By immersing ourselves in water, we are forced to recognize our existential estrangement from the physical universe. How long can we survive underwater? The experience of submerging drives home the realization that our existence in this world is transient. Now that's where you get in the Bible when Paul says life is just but a vapor. Ritual purification is the ritual prescribed by a religion by which a person is considered to be free of uncleanliness, especially prior to the worship of a deity, and ritual purity is a state of ritual cleanliness. Ritual purification may also apply to objects and places. Ritual uncleanliness is not identical with ordinary physical impurity such as dirt stains. Nevertheless, body fluids are generally considered ritually unclean. Most of these rituals existed long before the germ theory of disease and figure prominently from the earliest known religious systems of the ancient Near East. Some writers connect the rituals to taboos. Some have seen benefits of these practices as a point of health and preventing infections, especially in areas where humans come in close contact with each other. While these practices came before the idea of the germ theory was public in areas that use daily cleaning, the destruction of infectious agents seemed to be dramatic. Aren't we seeing this now with the coronavirus thing? This hyper germ theology that we are sanitizing everywhere and everything? It sounds like this. Others have described a dimension of purity that is universal in religions that seek to move us away from disgust at one extreme and to uplift us towards purity and divinity at the other extreme, away from uncleanliness to purity and away from deviant to moral behavior within one's cultural context. So if I was to understand this the way it's written, so a period is disgusting, and ejaculation is disgusting, and we ought to move away from that which is disgusting and into purity. That's why we need to constantly wash it. Wash it away. Wash it away. Did you know that when I was growing up, they would call menstruation the curse? And I wonder where that came from. Okay, in Judaism, spiritual purity is a desirable factor. This has nothing to do with hygiene and personal cleanliness. It is a spiritual state called tahara that we will call purity. The opposite of tahara is tuma, which we call impurity. But the truth is, it's very, very difficult to give an accurate English translation to these two terms, tahara and tuma, simply because they do not exist in the English language. These concepts do not exist any place other than in Torah. How come Nobody else knows about this. How would the world know if this were from God? If it's kept a secret? I'd like to ask that question. At any rate, the Torah describes many situations that can impart this state of impurity to a person. Among these is contact with a dead body. This is why when one attends a funeral, God forbid, one washes one's hands before entering one's homes, pouring water on each hand alternately 6 times in total. This is a spiritual formula for removing impurity from your hands. A person from the priestly family, a Kohen, is not allowed to go to a cemetery at all, except under special conditions. Another situation that can cause a person to become spiritually contaminated is the biblical disease of Dizerat, which was signified by patches of discolored dead skin. Yet another situation which causes impurity is birth. When a woman gives birth, she contracts a spiritual impurity. There are various other situations which the Torah describes that also causes impurity. The common denominator of all these kinds of impurity is that they are all somewhat related to the concept of death. Even childbirth is associated with death, not because of the dangers involved, but simply because the mother who has carried the child for 9 months had an extra soul in her, an extra life in her body during the pregnancy. During this pregnancy, a woman is extra pure. But when the child is born and leaves her body, even though the child is independently alive outside the mother's body, then as far as the mother's body is concerned, there was a loss of life. So that extra life that was in her body exited through her vagina. And now she's impure because that soul is gone. So there's a mourning that takes place inside the woman's body, and that is death. There was a loss of life. This loss of life is the reason for her temporary state of spiritual impurity. Similarly, when a man has discharged seed from his body, this seed can potentially impregnate a woman and cause a child to be born. There is a potential for life in every drop of seed. Every time a man lets his seed out, even if his wife becomes pregnant, he becomes impure, because that seed where there's a spark in there of life has left his body, and now he has become impure in a similar way. When a woman has her menstrual period every month, that egg which died, if it had become impregnated, could have been alive. And because it didn't catch, the menstruation is viewed as a carcass, a death, and cannot be touched, or you can't go near it at all. All right? And as you heard, I said a little while ago that they view this as disgust, human disgust. And this is why Paul writes, your righteousness is as filthy rags. Filthy rag is a menstrual cloth. You see, women are made to be ashamed of their genitalia. This is what God ordained for us here. He did not wish for women to be ashamed of their genitalia or any function of their genitalia. And somehow, through the translations of this Levitical law, it was imbued for women to follow these outrageous ritualistic rules of purification. This goes back to saying, why did God make us this way in the first place? And if you don't believe that God made us in his image, and if you don't believe that we are perfect in God's eyes, that we are wonderfully made by him, then you're going to believe that God didn't make you. And you're going to make corrections to his creation. An individual must be entirely naked. Even rings and earrings must be removed. Immersion must be full body. Once completed, the proper blessing must be recited with intent. This is meant to be more than simply a device for reversing a state of impurity. It is a means of infusing the soul with spirituality. It is no wonder that mikveh immersion is the final requisite for converting to Judaism, a spiritual rebirthing. This use of the mikveh for conversion of both men and women is common to every religious movement in Judaism. Now, does this sound familiar? Doesn't this sound like baptism, being immersed in water? Perhaps the highest incidence of mikvahs per capita was unearthed at the Qumran, along the shores of the Dead Sea, the assumed home base of the ascetic Essene sect of Judaism in the Roman era. 9 mikvahs were found at Qumran, which were meant to serve a population that historians estimate at no more than 200. The Essenes were incredibly stringent on matters of purity and impurity. According to the sect's literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they would immerse twice a day. The purist Essene sect may have had a profound effect on early Christianity and its own purification rites. Matthew 3 reports that John the Baptist was living an austere lifestyle in the Judean desert near the Jordan River. John vilifies the Pharisees and the Sadducees and then goes and baptizes Jesus and other Jews in the living waters of the Jordan. All of which indicates a smooth evolutionary transition from mikveh immersion in Judaism to baptism in early Christianity. See, when you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you really don't need to be baptized because the Holy Spirit baptizes you with fire. Even the primeval link between the basic elements of water, body, and spirit, it is only natural that mystical Judaism latched onto the mikveh as a tool for spiritual expansion. The Kabbalah teaches that the living water can remove forces of negativity in the individual. The Kabbalists of Tzvat would frequently immerse themselves in the cold spring water of Rabbi Isaac Luria's mikveh as part of a meditative regime, a practice that continues to this day. The Talmud lists 10 institutions that every good-sized Jewish community needs to have, such as a synagogue, ritual slaughter, and mikveh. The latter is of primary importance, so much so that the rabbis decreed that a community should even sell its synagogue building in order to finance the construction of a mikveh. Thanks for watching. I'll be back with more.